Welcome everybody to episode 4 of Talking Bollocks for Reef as Fuck. We've got a huge treat for you this week, which is a little talk on spawning by Dr. Michael Berry. And I am still overwhelmed why he has decided to A, join Reef as Fuck, and B, stay. But he's here and he's got a little presentation on coral spawning for us. So Mike, take it away.
All right. So this is our coral spawning talk. And the first thing we have to pay attention to is we're not experts. We're fucking hobbyists and probably idiots, honestly, to do this because it's so insane to do. But we're going to talk about it because the information on how to set up for spawning is out there, but we're going to try to make it as simple as possible. Because anybody could do this as long as you have some basic equipment. It's not hard to set up for it. Now, convincing everything to happen the way you want it to, that's a lot more difficult, but it's something you can at least try. So on that note, so importantly, we didn't originate any of this stuff. Jamie Craggs brought it to the hobby. It had been being done by other scientists at Carmaby, Ames, and other places for years before that. Although it really kind of developed in the past 15 years in terms of success with spawning and raising corals. Rich Ross's Magna talk got me into this. Once I saw that, I was inspired to be interested in this sort of stuff because honestly, after a while, just keeping things alive in a box was kind of dull. And I do appreciate what he did with that, and it was very groundbreaking. And I think all of us got interested in spawning based on that talk, or that and Jamie Craggs. So on that note, the question here is, what are your goals with doing spawning? And, some people just want to see if they can make coral spawn. I think there have been a couple videos recently that have been on YouTube where people have had successful spawns, and that's awesome. It means your corals are happy and healthy, and if you actually tried to do it, that's very impressive. If it just spontaneously, it's still impressive that you're a good enough, aquarist and husbandist to get everything happy enough to. Now, if you want to do the second option here, you want to spawn your corals and raise baby corals like a badass single parent, then that's an entirely different situation. So there's a big difference between a spontaneous spawn and a planned spawn, where you have everything spawning at the same time. Corals in captivity have been known for years to spontaneously spawn, where for whatever reason they just decide to spawn. And that's neat, but to have a synchronized spawning event like what happens in nature, that takes a lot more work. And that's kind of what this presentation is about.
Hey, Mike, can I interrupt real fast? Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Is there any knowledge of or any hypothesis on why corals will spontaneously spawn?
I mean, I think it's a survival and selection sort of thing. Essentially, if you spawn just randomly throughout the year, the predators can overwhelm that spawning, and to the point where you're not having a lot of success. Like at the Great Barrier Reef, so many corals are spawning that the fish and other things can't eat all the eggs. And so there will be increased survivability from that. And the corals set it up so it's at night, with under certain conditions so that it maximizes the chance of everything surviving, or at least that's what they've evolved to do. So I think that's kind of the basis for the synchronized spawning that we see. Now, that's not true of every type of coral, and we'll get into that later. But for the broadcast spawning hermaphrodites, which are basically 75% of all corals, that is kind of the way they approach it. Did that answer your question?
Yep.
And in that picture, what is the term for those white spots? Are those eggs, gametes? What's it actually called?
Basically spits it out its mouth. Those are the egg sperm bundles, and so you have sperm and egg basically stuck together, and those will eventually float to the surface and separate. Now they won't fertilize themselves, so you have coral of the same species to have fertilization of those eggs, but that's basically the idea with this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Alrighty, let's move on. All right, so there are two approaches to doing this, or two main approaches. You can import your corals essentially already pregnant and just birth the babies. So you bring in gravid colonies ready to spawn, or you can grow your corals to spawning size under your own conditions and convince them to spawn. And the second one's the one I chose, and that's probably the dumbest possible way to do it, and the most amount of work, but it is definitely something that more challenging and more interesting. And this is basically, by the way, this is a picture over the digitate monopora garden here. So they're like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different monoporas, theoretically of the same species, although no guarantees of that. So this would be an area where if they were to spawn, although monoporas spawn differently, you would see, hopefully fertilization.
See, for me personally, Mike, and I do want to give coral spawning a shot at some point in the future when I can get some space organized for it and just make sure I can have that controlled environment for it. But for me, importing an already pregnant coral is not, I don't find that particularly a satisfying thought. I would rather get a coral from A to Z the entire way myself. So I think the way you're doing it is the way I would do it, and I would find that to be far more satisfying.
Yeah, and without question, there are definitely some downsides to importing gravid colonies. The most pressing of which is the fact that they're not used to captivity. So, I mean, I think everybody's had corals that just don't do well in their system. And if you went through all the trouble to import a gravid coral that thereafter decides it doesn't like being in an aquarium, just like falls over dead, that's a huge waste of everything. You prevented that coral from spawning in the wild. You spend a bunch of money on it, and basically you're going to be frustrated that nothing worked out. So I agree with that.
With the
so if you're
gravid
going to
corals,
do that,
are they
Yeah.
intentionally collected gravid, or it's just like is it easy to identify when they're out there collecting them, or is it just something where, oh, we now noticed after the fact that these are gravid and we can do stuff with them?
it's going to vary from species to species. Some corals don't do broadcast spawning, but the ones that do, like Acropora and other things, it's the time of year. So there's a specific time when they start to produce eggs in the wild. And so if you purchase them during that time, so for like Great Barrier Reef, it's going to be like, October is the beginning, November, they're starting to produce eggs a fair amount, and late November or December is when the eggs mature to the point of spawning. I think spawning is like early December, typically over the Great Barrier Reef. So it's really, I mean, basically, if you wanted to get gravid colonies, you would have to like work with a coral buying place to get colonies at that point in time. Now, for other places in the Indo-Pacific that don't spawn at the same time, you're just gonna have to figure out when that is.
I do remember reading or hearing somebody, maybe Craig's or Ross or somebody doing it, that the importers actually will have their collection people break open the coral on site to see if there are eggs for those people who want ready to spawn corals. And I almost think that we need to look at this as two different avenues. Like you said, there are people who want to spawn corals from start to finish. There are people who want to raise baby corals. I think the people who want to raise baby corals don't want to deal with all the front end 3, 4, 5 year building a colony. I think some people think the science is in how do we grow a baby coral, and they want to cut the front end out.
Oh, no question. I mean, both of those things, the actual spawning and the actual raising, are incredibly difficult. And they really like, I'm not going to go into raising corals today because from babies, because one, I've never done it yet. And two, there's a lot involved in that. It's very difficult. There are many different approaches to it. The Caribbean people have their own way. The Australian people have their own way. Like Rich Ross has his own way. So there are a variety of different like approaches, but it's technically difficult and a lot of work. Spawning by comparison is just maintaining until they decide to go off. Anyway, so one of the things with if you're starting with gravid colonies, so you need to import them a couple months before they're ready to spawn. At that point, they should be developing eggs, and hopefully under your conditions, they'll continue to have the eggs mature. For some corals, that means the eggs turn from like white to kind of pinkish or salmon colored, and that's an indication they're ready to spawn. And you're right, cracking a branch and look at it is one of the methods you can use to see the maturity or presence of eggs in them. Of course, that's mostly a cropper and other branching corals, but certain other things, you know, it's going to be more difficult. Like the Porites that are in this picture here are broadcast spawners, but you're never going to be able to crack one open to see. You would have to like do a core or something like that, and no one's going to do that in their home. The other thing you have to do is you have to imitate where they came from. So if they came from Australia, you have to imitate conditions of Australia until they actually spawn. And because otherwise they won't have the cues for spawning. And there are a whole bunch of cues, which we'll go over in a little bit, but certain things like moonlight and temperature are majorly implicated into the actual cues that cause spawning to occur. So if you don't do that, you can import gravid colonies all you want, and they'll just resorb their eggs. So literally, that means if Ron wants to do an Australian tank, it's going to be like, well, actually, it's worse over here. Your tank's going to be lit at night, and during the day, it's not. It's going to be dark for it. So you have to deal with all the issues of like light leak and everything else, and then you'll never see the aquarium unless you're up in the middle of the night, things like that. So overall, it's going to be challenging, even if it's only for a couple of months till it spawns.
Yeah,
they should, assuming you do. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what I was thinking this morning. I was reading a little bit of what you had written towards this presentation, and I was thinking, well, the room I've got my tank in just now that I thought, well, could potentially in the future be used for spawning, isn't going to work unless I black out the tank, because I've got 6 Neptune doses in there with wee LED flashing lights on it. I've got thermometers with the temperature readout on them and LEDs. So there's a lot more light bleed in that room than I thought.
Yeah, and it only takes like 1 to 3 lux to apparently affect spawning. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but light is, not only does it affect spawning, it actually affects growth, they've shown. So if you have like, you know, artificial light at night, which we'll talk about later, it can actually retard the growth of corals, which is very interesting. Assuming you keep your gravid colonies in the same conditions they came from, they should spawn at roughly the same time as they would on the reef. So that's kind of nice because you know roughly when it should be, and very easy to predict, and you just set it up and it goes. Going to grow your own. Theoretically, we're good at doing this. And I do say theoretically because, as we all know, corals are very difficult to deal with sometimes. They'll do great and then they'll do poorly, something will go wrong, they'll die immediately, et cetera, et cetera. But if, you know, we can manage to keep it together for 3 or 4 years under spawning conditions every year, then they should be able to spawn at that point in time. They should become very acclimated to your tank conditions and be happy there and, you know, go ahead and spawn. Now, 3 or 4 years of perfect stability is difficult. And that whole time you have to have the corals under spawning conditions, because that's the key to actually making them spawn, is they have to be thinking that they're in the ocean, so that they get used to temperature changes, the lighting changes, the moonlight, et cetera, et cetera. And by the end of 3 years, theoretically, they should be ready to spawn and mature, assuming they grew well. So, and as I was saying, basically, your job is to convince them they're on a reef and not in your living room watching you eat your 4th slice of pizza. So you gotta like make it as oceany as possible for the corals. And if you do that, they should spawn. But our whole goal here is to create a simulation, just like the Matrix, for the corals so that they think they're in the ocean. And if we can do that, then they should be, at least some proportion of them should be willing to spawn. Now there's a lot more that goes into it, disease and feeding and other issues that can totally screw things up. But assuming you can manage all that stuff, that's what it takes to get them to spawn, is you have to imitate an ocean wherever. And that is something to talk about as well. So with our conditions, the things that are important, day and night length. So, just like, on our days and nights, the days get shorter and longer depending on what time of year it is. Corals expect that. So you have to have something that varies the length of your lighting period per appropriate cycling for, the conditions you want. And that's another thing. So these guys need to be planned for a tropical locale. So you could set if you're using Apex, set your site to be, say, the Great Barrier Reef if you want to do it in the middle of the night over here, or you could set it like I did to St. Croix, so that basically they're almost in the same time zone as me, so I can actually see them during the year. And so my systems actually are sent to St. Croix day and night length, the same moon cycles that St. Croix sees, the temperature changes in the water at St. Croix, and that's something you can fudge a little bit. And then, I make sure that the tank is truly blacked out. So in my system, which you guys have seen on my other tank tour, I have blackout panels surrounding the tank. And that prevents essentially light leak. In addition, the room I have them in has the windows basically covered with blackout as well to limit any of that as a factor that can affect things. And the darkness thing is something we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's kind of crucial apparently. I mean, all of it's crucial, and temperature being one of the major ones, but this is something that, the light leak is something that can definitely screw things up. And I think Rich Ross ran into this with his last batch of corals he spawned. He even made a comment saying he had to limit the light leak in his room because his corals spawned later than the other corals. So, all right, moving on. So the issue of switching to a spawning system is it's gonna change your reef tank. If your tank is something you have it set so when you get home at night it's on for like 3 or 4 hours so you can like enjoy it, that's gonna go away. So wintertime it's probably gonna be lights out before you get home, and summertime lights may be on a long time. You have to make sure that basically at night, if it's in the middle of your living room, it's covered up and dark like it's supposed to be. You have to set up moonlights for the whole thing. So it kind of changes it from like a hobby thing to something that like it's its own little world. And you have to maintain that little world the way it is, otherwise your corals won't spawn. And like I said earlier, if you're imitating something on the other side of the world, that means it's going, unless you work nights, you're never going to see your tank lights on. So nuts and bolts. Currently, unless you're really good at doing Reef Pi programming, Apex is the only thing you can use for spawning software. That may change in the future as there are new sort of systems coming online to control your tank. But currently, it's Apex or nothing. And I'm pretty sure that Jamie Craggs works with the Neptune people back 10 years ago or more to set the Apex up to certain things, because otherwise I have no idea why they would set it up. And to do this, you have to use your Apex local, which is essentially your direct communication to the Apex box. And once you pull up Apex local, and there's some text here on how to actually do that, it'll open up basically a hidden screen that you wouldn't see otherwise.
Oh, Russ,
that's going to be
his hand up, Mr. Berry, just to
sorry.
ask a question.
His hand's up. It's dark.
It was a little Zoom icon. I just had a question with the stuff. So you're trying to mimic a location, let's say Fiji. You're based in the US. Are you shifting what happens in Fiji to your time zone, or are you running the time zone of Fiji and like never adjusting
so that's
it like this?
So
I think you understand what I'm
that's-
at.
Yes. So you are, if you're running Fiji, then you have the time zone set to Fiji on your Apex. So that Apex thinks it's in Fiji.
Okay, so the actual
And
sunset,
so-
sunrise will be in Fiji, not your local.
Correct.
Awesome.
And that's a good point, which I didn't cover in here. You have to set the Apex up to do that. So, you know, I don't know how many hours ahead or behind that would be, but it would be significant.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering if we're just trying to put it on the time cycle of Fiji, how come we have to transfer what, like, I guess I'm confused about or don't understand the reasoning behind why, if it's on Fiji time, like right now, say if, you know, over there it's prime day daylight, or sorry, actually it's probably what, 14 or 15 hours in the future. So it's probably breaking dawn or something. And therefore, like right now, my tank lights wouldn't be coming on. I guess I just don't understand how come we don't set the day length, the temperature, and all that fun shit to like function as if it was right now. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think
So you mean-
like why can't we just make the corals have like a 4-hour time warp and stay in the dark for 4 extra hours and shift, and then all of a sudden, okay, you missed 4 hours, but everything's back to normal.
Yes.
I mean, just shift them over to your time, your local
Yes.
time.
Well, just
a
have like
sense.
a time jump.
Oh, okay.
Have like a time jump where you stay on the Fiji like cycle where it's just 5 hours shifted or 6 hours shifted.
Right.
Yes.
Is this where
that a
Ron
thing?
had the Rocky Horror Picture Show time warp stuff?
I can look into it, Ross. Thank you for your input.
Nice.
So essentially, longitude is like where you are, and latitude is how far you are from the equator. Is that it?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So you can choose the same latitude as Fiji, and then use, you know, someplace that's in that latitude in your part of the world, and use those conditions. So it doesn't have to be in the water. It could be
Okay,
in like
so
Mexico.
as long as it's like Fiji this way and Mexico probably this way, or like Brazil or whatever. Gotcha. Interesting.
Right. So I mean, and that's just for like moon and sun and things like that. For water temperature, I'll get into in a little bit. That has some fudge factor associated with it. And it really kind of depends on what you're doing. If you're bringing gravid corals from Fiji, you have to imitate Fiji, including the time
Right.
jump and everything else. Right. If you're growing corals, it doesn't matter at all. So hobby corals have been living under conditions of like set lighting, set temperature, no moon for so long, they have no idea where they are, what time of year it is or anything else. So maintaining your corals at like 77 degrees continuously is basically leaving them forever in the spring or fall. So that they don't have any thermal cycling, they don't have any change of seasons, and so they have no idea what's going on, which is part of the
Interesting.
deal of growing your own, is you have to get them back used to having changes of conditions. And so it takes several years for them to really kind of get in the swing of things and understand, you know, okay, this time of year it's such and such or whatever, so that they know to expect the changes. Once they can expect the changes, then they can actually start producing eggs and consider spawning. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Cool. Thank you.
So, yeah. So back to so, and that's why I use St. Croix, because it's basically the same like longitude as me, but latitude is similar to like the Great Barrier Reef. I went literally, I'm OCD enough that I went and checked that. So it reasonably well works. And I do it with my tank, some extra stuff on top of that. Like, you know, I do lighting pre-dawn and post sunset as well, just to like fully imitate it. And with that extra lighting, I have it set very specifically to equate to a certain part of the world, but I don't think that's necessary. It's just something I do. So back to Apex local. So once we bring down the menu from this, we go to miscellaneous on the menu, that pops up this window over here, the miscellaneous window. Once we have the miscellaneous window, we click on the sun icon, which thereafter pops up the season tables. The season tables is where you set what you do every year. And you have to basically put in every single month of the year coming up, and the Apex will use those season tables to program your lights, your temperature, et cetera, moon cycles, whatever. Since I'm using Apex for this, I have the Lunar Simulator module, the LSM, and their string lights, which we'll get into in a little bit. That's my moonlighting, and let the Apex control the sunrise, sunset for everything. And temperature tables, I have a little slide on in a second. So the information I got, so I'm using St. Croix, came from Time and Date. So it's a website that you can put in most places in the world, and it will tell you what the temperatures are like. Water temperatures, I also got from, I forget whether it was Time and Date or another place, but they're usually something you can find for most places that are like island or otherwise, or you can just make your own. And once you fill out these tables, the Apex will start to follow the cycle. So it interpolates between each month, you know, when you're sunrise, sunset, moonrise, etc. The only thing that really changes year to year is the moon cycles, because they're a 28-day cycle, and we're not set up for 28-day months or whatever. But you have to, so starting like January 1st or just like December 31st, you have to reset these tables every year to the values for the next year. Sunrise, sunset won't change much. Water temperature shouldn't change, but the new moon and the moonrise, moonset do change every single year. So you have to make sure, like the beginning of the year, you have that set up. It's not hard to do, but it's just something you have to remember. So one of the things that I've run into with people is questions about the temperature table. So hobby corals, obviously, usually kept at like 77, 78 degrees. And with that, people become very paranoid about changing the temperature in the tank. They have it like set on these hyper controlled things where if it goes up like 1 degree, they freak out or something like that. That's kind of silly, honestly. Like the Great Barrier Reef currently is sitting in 90-degree water. Now that's not necessarily the greatest of things, but you know, water temperature changes every year. It gets down to roughly low 70s and it goes up to roughly 85 or hotter nowadays, on like reefs, the same reefs these corals came from. And so like I've done, it's like almost 5 years now of doing thermal variation in my tanks. I've never lost a coral from it. Hottest I took it up to was 84, and things looked a little dicey. And so I backed off and went back to 83. But otherwise, they do great. I
Now, with
haven't
that in
seen any
mind,
bacterial outbreaks. What?
now with
What was
that
that?
in mind, how'd your fish react?
Didn't seem to notice.
No, huh? Interesting.
Yeah.
So do you?
I mean,
So then do you need to do some? If you're mimicking, are you mimicking temperature off of this program, or are the
yes.
temperatures basically just like programmed in? Like it's gonna be about this, or is there something pulling data from a weather site saying, okay, temperatures are this, bring your temperature up to this?
Basically what I did, so imitating St. Croix, is I looked at the water temperatures through the year on a monthly basis and used that as like a way to pick where I was going to be. And then I
Okay.
basically like brought it down a little bit because like St. Croix in the summer is 85 degrees in the water, surface
Yeah.
temperature. So I like backed mine off. So
Okay.
you don't have to be 85 degrees because that's at the surface. I read about this as well. So surface water temperatures tend to go down about 30 feet, but it can be variable. The deeper you go, the less likely it is to be the same as the surface temperature. So essentially, you know, if you're imitating like a coral that lives at 30 feet, you can probably drop the temperature a degree or two and still be within realm. But it doesn't have to be, I think the temperature thing is something we're going to talk about actually right here. It's got to be above 81.5 roughly. That's where spawning tends to happen. So essentially, once it gets above 81.5, you know, 82 degrees or so, corals are, at least Great Barrier Reef corals, are much more likely to spawn. Caribbean corals may be different. They have a lot of different cues versus the Pacific corals, but usually around 81.5 degrees is where things are more likely to occur. And the other thing is spawning usually happens, there's a paper on this, in the months where there's the greatest flux in temperature. So essentially spring cool water suddenly warms up to more summery temperatures above 81.5 in between 2 months. And with that flux, that sudden increase in temperature is what is one of the spawning cues. So it tells the coral, hey, the water is suddenly rising in temperature, time to start making eggs. The actual
what's
cues
that
for release.
low?
What
is that lower spring water temperature? Like, how big is the variance?
That is the next slide. And we'll get to there in 1 second.
Damn it, Ross.
So
you are so prepared. I just need to buckle up and watch because you're
I don't
you
want
know
you to
what
buckle
you're
up and
doing.
watch. We have to have a conversation.
Shut the fuck up, taters.
You
I'll
suck.
go back in my burlap sack.
So things to be aware of.
I will continue to derail. With the higher temps, do you notice anything else maintenance-wise, system-wise, that you have to do having that temperature swing? Like maybe increased evaporation? Like, do you notice differences with dosing? Like, is there anything that seems to come along with adding these
Algae
temperature swings?
So nothing grossly different. Coral growth may slow down in the warmer temperatures because I read there's some paper that's like 20 years something years old that showed that maximum growth was around 78 degrees, 77, 78, which is why I think people keep their tanks there. I think it's like ancient information in the hobby that people adopted and then got lost as to the reason why. Also, 77, 78 is a safe temperature to be at for people who basically are just kind of newbies in the hobby. But so growth for some corals may slow down. Other corals actually may speed up as the temperature rises. I've seen some papers where they talk about how coral growth increases right up to the bleaching point. Once it hits the bleaching point, obviously immediately. But like if you're like a half degree below the bleaching threshold, then growth actually increases for some corals, which is kind of crazy. But overall, nothing really different. It's basically the same. And in that, so your two brackets here for temperature are 84.5 Fahrenheit and 65 Fahrenheit. Those are the high and low bleaching temperatures on average. Some corals can take up to 90 plus degrees, but 84.5, if you get above that, you're likely to bleach. Below 65, also likely, which is why I like shipping corals in the wintertime. If they get cold and show up, they may end up bleaching. So those are things to pay mind to. The other thing is your temperature probe is not that accurate, especially the one for the apex. So what I did with mine is I double checked water temperature with several different thermometers and then reset it to what I came up to as an average because it was not exactly right. Which is why when I was saying 84.5 is your maximum temperature, you probably need to back that down a couple degrees because you don't know if your temperature probe is perfect or not. So more about temperature. Here's the temperature profile that I'm using for one of my tanks. So that's a little higher than the other tank. But essentially you can see, so this is St. Croix imitation, theoretically. And we drop the temperature down in the winter time. So starting in December, it drops to 78, January down to 76, then February and 75. And then once we hit spring, it starts to warm up again. So we like kind of creep up to May. And then May to June is where the big jump is. So we have a 4-degree jump between those 2 months. So that's your temperature flux that helps to push for spawning. So, and then you maintain the higher temperature. You can push it as high as you want. I'll probably back down to like 82.5 for most months. And then it slowly cools down. So surprisingly, water temperature stays warm for quite a while. Like in St. Croix, October water temperatures are like still in the 80s. And so after October, there's kind of this kind of fairly quick drop off and it drops 4 degrees over the next 2 months. But the big
Mike,
6 months, yes.
So you're obviously using Apex to drive your heaters. What what other gear are you using? Like what type of heaters are you using? What are you like? What kind of swings off of those temperatures are you getting? Like how many heaters do you have in that system? How many, you know what I mean? What watts are you running? And
honestly, I have two 300-watt heaters, and I think the only job they do is keeping it warm at night. Because during the day, the massive, massive amount of lighting that I have on the tank keeps everything more warm than I want. So I think that the lighting during the day actually heats the water a fair amount. But essentially, I have mine, like I said, mine's very OCD. The tank drops 1.5 degrees in temperature overnight to imitate what happens in a reef. Because, if you go on a reef at night, it's cooler than it is during the day. So that temperature drop from day to night is imitated in my tank. So I allow the temperature to drop 1.5 degrees, and then it warms up during, the morning of the next day up to the maximum temperature and then cools down. So it has this very like, sinusoidal sort of like temperature waveform here. Yeah, I
And
don't think you necessarily have to do that.
Like Ron mentioned, you have an awesome tank tour out there on the YouTube channel, but what's your overall water volume again? This is the big trough system, right? Was that 8x4?
Yes. Yes, the size of a bed. So it's roughly 420 gallons total for that. So two 300-watt heaters do a fine job of maintaining, because I don't get OCD about keeping the temperature locked in. It's going to vary from day to day in the ocean, just like it varies from day to day in the tank. If I have like a warm day in the middle of winter, like we currently have, and then I have to turn the air conditioning on, the temperature may get a little higher than I would otherwise want. But overall, it's kind of the average of temperature that we're looking at.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I have my controller, running a pretty tight set for the heat, the temperature. So I do not have those kinds of swings. I'm sure, like a lot of hobbyists, it's a degree, half a degree, whatever. Everyone figures, ooh, tighter, more stable, better. But this has given me something to seriously think about.
That's actually a good point, because it's been shown that this sort of temperature variation actually makes corals more likely to tolerate whatever happens. Like, if you had like a flux of something or other, it makes them more hardy. If you keep them locked into one little setting, they're less hardy.
Yeah, and it may just be me being a bit of a control type personality, but it's like, hey, I'm using this controller, I'm using this heater, I can control the heat. I want it 77.5 all the damn time. But
Right.
now
I think that's very reasonable. I mean, the corals are really hard to keep alive in the first place. So I totally support, doing whatever OCD things keep them alive for you. Because keeping them alive and happy is the #1 thing to actually make them spawn. So everything else is, just kind of icing on that cake. So
keeping them alive. Keeping them alive is the #1 thing to make sure they spawn.
Yes, kind of hard to spawn dead corals.
Oh, Zach has a question.
Yeah.
Hey, so I didn't want to interrupt. I don't kind of try to avoid that, but is there such thing as anyone looking at or trying to instead? I see your temperature table, right? And you have it based on monthly changes, but what if one were to want to attempt to, instead of every 4 weeks on average, do it by bi-weekly or every 2 weeks? Could you technically or theoretically spawn or quicken the cycle to spawn sooner in like half the time?
I mean, that's an interesting idea. I don't have an answer for that. I mean, essentially, you would also have to have your day length and moon cycles also running half time.
Right.
It's an interesting idea. It might work. I know Rich Ross has like tried to like phase shift some of his like spawning stuff to make them spawn earlier. So that may be a possibility. I am not an expert on that.
I'll have to take a look to see if I can find anything on it.
Yeah, you would essentially like interpolate 2 years into 1 year if you were doing that.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. I don't know whether you can or not. You would have to have a lot of like temperature control in the room they're in. Like the way I have mine set up, it's nicely cold in the wintertime, so I don't have to worry about like air conditioning the hell out of the room they're in to be able to get it down to like, 74 degrees. But I think that's an interesting idea.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All righty. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? All right. So Moonlights, So you got to have moonlights. Moon cycles are one of the major things that trigger spawning. It's typically a certain number of days after the full moon that corals spawn. And so, you know, with the apex, you have like increasing, you know, moonlight intensity, and you know, the moon setting ends up being like a full moon at certain times of the year, night, as opposed to in the day or whatever. But you have to be able to program them. If you can't program moonlights, or if you have just like quote unquote a moonlight that never changes or is always on, like, you know, say 8 to 4 a.m. or something like that, it's not going to work. So the programmable moonlights are kind of a critical thing, as well as the temperature and the day length and everything else. So Apex has its LSM module and its string lights. There's a lot of like questions with the string lights themselves. They're blue, so they're the 470 blue nanometer LEDs. They don't have halide ones. I don't know why. Anyway, so they have 470 nanometer LEDs.
We need
and so
moon
initially,
UVB. Moon UVB.
exactly. That is underappreciated. So like Jamie Craggs was changing his out for like 4100 Kelvin, like kind of like warm white ones, because that's Moonlight's actually warm white. It's 4100 Kelvin or somewhere in that range. But the caveat of that is it's warm white on the land. The water of the ocean takes away the red and light very quickly. Within 10 feet, most of it's gone. So a coral living at 30 feet is not going to see 4100 K. It's still going to see blue light. It's going to be filtered from the water above it. So the moonlight color is probably a moot point with this. In addition, the intensity of the moonlights is like 10 times what you should have. It's probably a limitation of the LEDs and the way they have them set up. But, you know, for me, like, this is my tank, and I have the infamous giant ping pong balls on the lights. And now they actually have a double layer of giant ping pong balls on them to like decrease it further. So I went and actually like tested the lux, and it was still running high.
Oh, so
so now I had the lux. What?
You've changed it up slightly.
Just slightly, yes.
Yeah,
so
double
like the maximum lux, yes. They look much more like a bollock than they did.
I just wanted to say double skinned your balls, but Russ has another question.
Yes.
So is it the temperature that triggers the spawning? Can the spawning happen with the temperature and without the lights, or are both necessary?
I think yes, but to have synchronized spawning, that's where you have to have everything. So like, again, places like I've seen a couple like coral vendors where they had just like a little bit of temperature variation in the room the corals were in. And with that, they ended up with spawning or egg development or things like that, but they didn't have a synchronized spawn. That's kind of the goal here, is to have synchronized spawning.
I'm just thinking of Valentine's Day, if you were to go home and put Barry White on, but throw a bag of Haribo in the bed, or if you were to have a beautifully home-cooked meal but have death metal on, it's, you know, you've got to have both.
Yes, depending on what you're doing.
I think that, so I was thinking about it wrong. The spontaneous spawning is going to be spontaneous. Duh. So this is when you're controlling it, when you're making it happen.
Correct. Yes. We're attempting to have synchronized spawning that like we can plan on. So for my system, I have no idea when they're going to actually spawn, assuming they do, because they've never spawned before in here. So I've just got to like keep an eye out somewhere in like, you know, May, June, when I have like the big temperature flux, and just look for indications of spawning. Also, I don't know whether the corals are really happy enough yet to do that. And that's something I'll get into in a second. But yeah, I mean, you got to have all the stuff there, or at least most of the stuff, to make it happen in a controllable, repeatable fashion. So that's the whole idea of synchronized spawning. All right. So, and so what you want moonlight lux wise is like 0.3 lux. That's probably to actually imitate the moon. That's probably not that critical, but it's something to be aware of. All right, so we got all the hardware. What about the frickin' corals? So coral biology, you got to know a little bit about that. So corals do not all spawn the same. Breeders and broadcast spawners are the two main camps, and we'll talk about that. So the difference is brooders. So that's like, you know, Poecilophora, Stylophora, Seriatopora, Euphyllia, etc. They internally fertilize, whereas the Acropora and everything else externally fertilize. And that's the main difference between the two. So like, you know, you get green Poecilophora in your tank, or the pink or whatever, and suddenly you start having them pop up everywhere. So what's happened is assuming you have more than one colony, is basically one colony released some sperm, the other colony picked the sperm up. It internally fertilizes its eggs inside of its tissue, and then it releases a planula. So the planula basically is a little swimming baby coral, and it'll swim around the tank. It'll find something that it likes to land on. It'll form a new coral there. And that's why people hate some of the Poecilophoras, because they do this constantly. They will tend to do it during the year continuously, at low levels. And so they're not the same sort as like an Acropora, which is only going to spawn once a year. Stylophora and Seriatopora and Euphyllia also will do that as well. So those are pretty cool and possibly a little easier to deal with this. So if you want to do something like that, they're probably going to be a little better behaved than some of the like Acroporids and things like that. So broadcast spawners are the other flavor, and they have sub-flavors too. So hermaphrodites and gonochorics. So the hermaphrodites are like the Acropora. So one time a year or a couple of days a year, they release an egg sperm bundle, which is the thing in the picture that we saw before, in synchrony with others of the same species. Usually, like I said, it's a certain number of days after the full moon, at about the same time every year. So the egg sperm bundle floats up to the surface. It separates within about an hour. The egg and sperm go off to be fertilized by others of the same species. And then you end up again with a planula that develops and searches around for a place to settle and become a coral. Those can last usually a couple of weeks, but they can last up to 17 weeks, which is kind of insane, but for certain specific examples. The other flavor is gonochorics. So these have two sexes, and Galaxia is one of the main ones for this. So essentially, they'll release eggs or sperm, not both. And so essentially, they just have a synchronized spawn. Eggs and sperm are released in the water, and you get the same idea. They get fertilized, you get a planula that develops, the planula swims around, finds a place to live, and settles down. So with that, you have to have at least two of every species to get an actual fertilized spawn. You can get a spawn without that, but if you want to fertilize it, you got to have more than one of each species. And with gonochorics, it may be more because you have such diluted sperm and egg by comparison to the ones that are hermaphrodites, which tend to produce a ton more. So like in this picture, there are like 1, 2, 3, 4 Vallidas. I thought that was a Vallida, but it's actually something else. It's probably an Asuta. And like the next picture, here we have Sarmentosa, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 varieties of it. Not all of which are full size, but like this guy's getting close to spawning size. Same with this guy. And some of these guys are as well. So you have to have multiples to get a successful fertilized spawn. These poor guys have been pooped on by my stupid rabbitfish so many times they have like dead areas in them because the rabbitfish poop kills them off. But soon we're going to be rid of rabbitfish, and that hopefully won't be a problem anymore. So another topic to discuss, like we did talk about earlier, so artificial light at night is something that we became aware of. There are some papers out of like Israel a few years ago that basically where they took kind of a LED light and they set it at the lowest setting and they put it over corals at night to imitate like light from, at the beach from like houses and things like that. And at 1 to 3 lux of light pollution, they stopped growing well, and they did not spawn, or at least they had discoordinated spawn, which means that, like Ron was saying, all of our like equipment that has fancy LED lights on it, those LED lights will kill your spawn potentially. And so you have to either cover them up or find some other way to black the tank out so that you get everything nice and dark. Also, they noticed with the study they did that coral growth came kind of to a halt from this, because the zooxanthellae, the symbiodinium, basically get confused as to what's night and day. They need to have a blackout time for photosynthesis reasons in order to like regenerate for the next day. And the artificial light at night affects that. And so you also affect growth of the coral. So the darkness actually may help your tank grow better. And the other thing is for spawning, there's a period between when the sun goes down and when the moon rises at the time of year when spawning occurs that has to be dark, and it has to be a certain length of time. That certain length of time and of darkness is one of the triggers that causes spawning to occur. So if you have like, you know, your Jabal controller blasting blue light during that time, it's going to screw it up. And so that's why you have to have blackout for your system.
How much genetic diversity
Also,
is there in
yes.
coral? Like if you go back 2 slides where you had the picture of the 4 colonies that are getting kind of ready to spawn.
Mm-hmm.
So they're hermaphrodites. They're going to release their eggs and their sperm. It's all going to commingle with the other 4 or 5 colonies, whatever. So how much diversity is there in the babies, or is it all just kind of the same thing since it's the same type of coral?
There should be a fair amount of diversity, actually. Yeah, I don't know how much variance there is in like the coral world versus human world, but it's not like they're first cousins and you know they should marry sort of thing. There is a wide range, and the reality is I don't even know if these are all in truth the same species of Valida, because some of the indications in recent research is that what we thought were all just slight variations of the same species across the Indo-Pacific end up all being different species. The question is whether those different species actually can produce babies with one another or not, and that's unclear at this point in time. But I would say there's probably a lot more variance. Yeah, hybridization. But like when they split tenuous recently, so you know everybody was like, okay, tenuous, it is all across the Indo-Pacific, it's all the same thing. Yeah, but not. And so now there's tenuous from Fiji, there's Bifaria from the Indo-Pac, there's Kinti from the Great Barrier Reef, and then there's a couple others from like Mauritania or something like that, and from South Africa. So there's now like a whole bunch of species where they thought it's all just one with slight variation. So realistically, we have no clue how much variation there is species-wise in the Acropora and that we have in the hobby. Some of these may be from completely different parts of the world and they may not cross at all. But one of the ways to tell if they are the same species or at least close to that is to try to spawn them. Because if they cross and you end up with babies, then they're at least close enough to produce babies, so they're fairly similar species.
Thank you. That's a very
sense?
thorough answer. Yeah, it's just my ignorance. I didn't know if like, you know, all of coral ABC is pretty similar without, you know, a lot of variation like with people. So very helpful. Thank you.
All right. So coral size and spawning is one of those things that's kind of difficult to discuss. It's not clear. Some of the literature says like in the wild, some corals have to be 40 centimeters, like the parietes I was showing earlier, the purple parietes. Probably have to get to be like 1.5 feet across before they'll spawn, realistically. That we'll see if that's actually the case. But in the wild, most of those massive corals have to be massive before they'll produce babies. For acroporids and other branching corals, that may or may not be the case. It really kind of depends on the conditions, the coral, and other things. But somewhere between 2 inches and, you know, like 16 inches in size are the requirements for spawning. And, you know, growing a coral to that size is actually difficult. But I've seen several things where Jamie Craig says he doesn't think they have to get that big anymore for a lot of the species for them to spawn. So that may or may not actually be the case. Beyond that, branches that are under a year old will not produce eggs because they are not sexually mature, or at least for a cropper. So they have to get to be at least a year of age for them to make eggs. And below that, they will not make eggs. So like my tank, most of the colonies are about a year in size. They've grown out from over the past year and a half. Like this is a year and a half of growth for this Latticella. So probably not going to spawn. There could be potentially some spawning from like deep down in the coral, but may have to wait another year or so for that to occur. And that's that. All right, let the fuckery begin at this point.
Well, I absolutely loved that, Mike, and I'm sure there are definitely more questions. I was really struggling to behave during that. It's very
You're
seldom.
not supposed to behave.
Yeah, it's very seldom I can hear the word sperm and remain mature and calm. But you managed it, Mike. So thank you.
With the lights, you said it's a cool white at night for moonlights.
So the initial thought was that was necessary. It's not necessary. Hasn't been proven to be the case. But that's something you can do. The little LEDs in like the lights that Apex, the Apex moonlights are very easy. Basically, just clip a wire, take them out, and you can solder in a new 4100K light if you want to. I don't think it matters.
I did that. I did modify when I had my my Apex system. I had my moonlights modified, but with the refi that I have now, it actually has moon phases programmed into it, so it follows the natural moon phases where you're at. But like, it's programmed to a blue light on the programming that's there. I was just gonna change it over real quick to a white light. I mean, I'm not gonna try to actually spawn anything, but I actually like the white moonlight more. So I didn't know if that would affect anything else. That's basically what I was trying to get at.
I don't think it's really well known. I think, like I said, absorption of red spectrum by water happens fairly quickly. So whatever the moonlight, like a 4100K bulb is still going to have blue in there, and the blue is going to be the stuff that penetrates down on a reef. And so white versus blue probably doesn't matter. You couldn't have like red moonlights, that wouldn't work. In fact, red is what you use to look at corals at night when you're like getting ready to spawn, because it doesn't affect the corals. They have no receptors for that at night. So you use like a red headlamp or something like that
instead of the blue flashlight sold it for the high.
Right. Well, what I was thinking with coral growth at night, if running the blue light as a moonlight was too much, and cutting it back to the white light would make it better off for actual growth of the corals. I guess that's kind of where I was going with it.
Gotcha. Hard to say. So if you're actually imitating moon cycles and you're not like blasting light continuously. So the study that came out of Israel, basically, they had the lights on continuously at one setting all night long, with moonrise, moonset, and like varying intensity through the month of the amount of moonlight. That's more likely to be accepted because it happens in nature. The moon rises, the corals get some illumination from the moonlight, and it doesn't affect their growth. It's just if you have like something continuously on, that it's more likely to affect it. Also, probably the fact that it affects their metabolism. So literally the zooxanthellae don't work as well, or Symbiodinium don't work as well when they've been illuminated at night. That's probably a metabolic clock in some regards. So, the nights where they have a full moon, the metabolism of the coral the next day is going to be decreased because the Symbiodinium or whatever got lit at night. So like the dark nights, it's probably going to grow more, sort of thing. So that actually makes a moon clock via metabolism within the cell.
Right. There's no way. I just looked. There's not really any way on the refi to see what the moon profile is, but he does have it programmed to like set on different phases. So it's kind of cool because I mean, some nights you walk down and it's bright, and another night it's pitch black. So
I think some people asked if he could set it up so it wouldn't be programmable, and he didn't understand why. So I mean, I think if you worked with him, he would probably like make it so you could set it to wherever you wanted it to be.
So we talked about, the key factors, but what about what about all other factors that hobbyists deal with that the corals in the ocean don't deal with. For example, water parameters, salinity shifts, nitrates, phosphates. Do we know anything about any of that?
I mean, I think the answer is to make them happy. And so the standard stuff you do to make your tank happy, on a day-to-day basis, just keep doing that. If they're growing and they look happy, I think that's probably the best thing. I mean, if you watch some of these underwater videos, like there's an underwater camera in Florida, there used to be one in the Pacific as well. Water is what we think is like reef conditions. Not so much. There are days where the water is so dirty you can't see through it. There are like, storms and everything else. It rains like, changes salinity. Corals are used to all these things. So, I mean, I think realistically, as long as you make them reasonably happy, they'll probably do well.
Throwing a bunch of microplastics for them.
That too.
Some turds, things like that. Yeah, that's
exactly. Some bird poops in the tank, whatever.
Gotta make it natural.
Absolutely.
With the coral broadcast spawning, does anyone collect the egg and sperm bundles and try to inseminate?
So yes, absolutely. So coral slicks, as they're known, they're like the spawning volume is so much, it makes mile-long slicks on the surface of the ocean, especially over the Great Barrier Reef. And you literally can just take a boat and go like kind of scoop some of that up. And it'll be probably a combination of like developing eggs and dead eggs and non-fertilized eggs and planula and all sorts of other stuff. But essentially you can get baby corals out of that. And so I know the scientists have done it. I'm willing to bet there's a lot of legislation that says don't screw with this out there. But it's definitely something that's not impossible to do. But again, then you get into part 2 of all this, which is raising them. And that is like a lot of work, at least initially.
So once you get your corals to spawn, you have such a diverse tank. Will multiple corals spawn at the same time? Multiple species of corals spawn the same night? Will you have to decipher what is what, or are they pretty?
So the idea is basically once you see them set, so they have the egg sperm bundle essentially in the mouth of the polyp. Once they set, you can like capture individual like releases. And one of the ways they do it, I meant to put the picture up, is they take a plastic funnel, and they stick literally a plastic test tube on the end of it and glue it in place, and then set that on top of the coral that's spawning to collect the eggs. That way you can collect from specific corals, like specific eggs, and then you can cross them outside. The other thing you can do is what's called coral soup, where you literally just take all the eggs and sperm, mix it together in a big vat, and then let whatever develop. They won't outcompete each other, but you have a greater chance of having like bad water conditions and things like that. And a lot of like the initial like week or two of getting corals to get going has to do with bacterial issues and water quality issues, and you have all these like eggs breaking down and releasing a crap ton of nutrients in the water, so you have to manage all that.
So we're seeing growth anomalies and issues with corals that we're growing in our tanks. Do we know?
Yes, we are.
Do these happen in the wild, or when these things do happen in our tanks, will that affect spawning as well?
So true growth anomalies, which are typically like tumor-like growths of corals where they lose any zooxanthellae, symbiodinium, they turn white and they grow like a mass. Those absolutely decrease the chance of spawning at that location. What I'm seeing in my tank, I'm not certain of. Essentially each individual polyp looks fairly normal, but I have this stunting sort of growth stunting thing that I picked up. I know exactly where I picked it up from an online vendor. And whether that will affect it, I don't know. So I'm going to give it a year or two. And if I don't get spawning within a year or two, then I will probably restart the system because it just doesn't make any sense to grow like diseased corals. I've tried everything I could to treat that, but I have not had success, which makes me think either it's a parasite I can't kill or it's a virus. It could be like a weird bacteria, but I kind of doubt it. I have had other probably bacterial related things due to starting with Florida live rock, which I would never recommend doing again. And there's always a possibility that the Florida live rock brought another virus in that's affecting things. But regardless, the proof is going to be in the pudding. If they spawn, I'm okay with it. You can still look weird as long as you're making babies. If they don't spawn, then I have to reassess. And I think that's true for many people. I think realistically, we should have like a little presentation on diseases that we see in the tanks, including parasites, because we could probably have a lot of conversation about that.
So, Mike, when is your cutoff point going to be that these corals are not playing ball? I mean, you're saying a couple of years. That is a tremendous amount of effort to go to for potentially these diseased corals not to spawn. So, when is that day that you feel comfortable that 2 years worth of effort you just bin?
So it takes at least 3 typically for corals to get to the point where they will spawn. So I really haven't made it to the point where I can just say, you know, this is not working. But I mean, I think that's something that I will keep in mind. You know, when I started, I had like great plans and everything else, and I've kind of pared those back because some things have done well. Like I have a bunch of colonies of Cherokee that are doing fantastic, absolutely growing leaps and bounds. No evidence of disease, just doing fantastic. And like have other things like the Montiferas are doing fantastic as well. Variety of other different like, you know, croppers seem to be doing well. So I don't know what to do with that. You know, when I have a very mixed sort of appearance, like the Latistella, I have this guy, unbothered, not any problems with the disease. There's one that's basically 4 inches away from it that has been definitely bothered by disease, although it's trying to grow out of it. So, I mean, this guy's good, and I have a couple other Latistella that look good. I think it's coral to coral, and we'll just have to see. Like some of these guys have issues, I can tell. This guy's fine. This guy's fine. This guy has a little bit, you can see the lumpy sort of look to the so like this guy here has some like misshapen sort of branches. Like this and this. A few misshapen branches in this guy, but some of these corals seem to be able to grow out of whatever is going on with that. And it's mostly the corals that aren't from captivity that I see that on. So like this one came from battle corals and doesn't seem to be bothered by it at all. This one came from unique corals and seem to be bothered. This one was, you know, some other place and doesn't seem to be bothered. But these guys that came from the wild are much more bothered. Even if we go back, and so like here's this Parides here, unbothered, completely fine, no issues whatsoever. The Millies are branching out. They seem to be okay, although they're growing a little bit weird. And like here, this is like a fairly young, either Bifaria or Kinti, you know, tenuous type, and it seems to be unbothered too. But then, like, if you look at this, so this is the Oregon blue tort, like, that's not normal. And the weird kind of look on the parenchyma, the roundedness of like some of the branch tips in some places, like, that's not normal looking. That's not normal. And whatever this is, it seems to be fairly widespread amongst the hobby vendors because I've seen it online on some of the forums and I've seen it in corals for sale. This problem, whatever this is, where you see like these polyps are way bigger than they should be and the branch is stunted. It's been trying to grow a branch, but it can't. I found it on battle corals. TSA sells their blue, their Valley Blue Slimer. That absolutely is affected by it. And then I have Unique Corals has a different sort of weirdness that they sell in a lot of their corals that look cool but are actually. So a variety of these guys have stuff that they're selling. Whether they're aware they're diseased or not is indeterminate. But I mean, there's something wrong here. And I don't know if it's bacterial, parasite, virus, whatever. But I also haven't found a good way to treat it, unfortunately.
That's quite concerning.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately.
And it's not being talked
And
about.
it spreads.
As far as I'm aware, I don't remember anyone else talking about this.
Well,
So-
I mean, it may just be because I've been like trying to sleuth to an answer as to what's going on.
I mean, is it down to the fact that most hobbyists are buying a coral? And I mean, I'll be totally honest, that tort you have on screen right now is absolutely stunning. If that was in my tank right now, I wouldn't be going, oh, those polyps are weird. I'd be like, that's gorgeous color, and I'd be over the moon with it. But somebody with your set of eyes is looking at that and saying, well, that's fucking weird. And as hobbyists, I think we need to be a little bit more careful with what's going where. I mean, if these are being sold and widespread and they're going to affect other corals, then this could be disastrous, especially if they don't.
Correct. Yeah, it's something to watch out for. And like I said, I don't know that the vendors are aware of it even, but I definitely have seen it from multiple vendors. You know, at this point, I'm actually like acquiring a file of like stuff that I've seen from different vendors that are clearly diseased corals. But, you know, I don't know what to do about it beyond that. It's not like I'm going to be able to go on one of the bulletin boards, hey, these vendors that send you money are selling diseased corals. I'm pretty sure that thread would disappear immediately. So
You heard it here first.
we'll see.
Have you noticed anything like on like the skeletal structure? Is it like, can you tell the disease in the skeletal structure if the coral was dead, like where the polyps have,
Whether it's the tissue,
right?
yeah, whether it's like the sinusoid soft tissue versus the actual skeleton. There are skeletal changes, no question about it. So, but again, the question is, where is the disease process and what is the disease process? And that's a good question. Like I worried about like, could this be trace metal contamination? But I've run like 14 ICPs and then last year and nothing has shown up as like a major red flag. And everything, like some things just like flourish and don't seem to have any issues. But, you know, we are so limited both in the hobby and scientific knowledge about coral disease and coral problems that it's really, you know, you got to figure it out for yourself. Nobody can tell.
That's kind of like, I'm curious as if even with like mushroom corals and soft corals where people are selling like the bounce, you know, like to me, when those came out, it just looked like sunburn. So I'm almost curious if it's some kind of something to do with like the artificial lighting that we're using to grow the corals that's causing something in the tissue to change it. I don't know. Just a thought.
I don't have an answer for that, but there's definitely like a lot of potential. So think of it this way: in the ocean, you have an unlimited amount of water passing over this coral, right? So there's always like fresh water passing over it. In an aquarium, they're literally swimming in their own excrement continuously. The same water is being circulated around them. So if you put one little tiny infectious particle in there, that's going to be everywhere, just like coral diseases. So they literally just kind of swim in their own filth constantly. Now you can do things like UV and like ozone and things like that to try to improve that. But the likelihood of infection spreading in a closed system is extremely high. So, I mean, I suspect it's something parasite, virus, bacteria, something of that sort that causes problems. There have been quite a few posts in the past couple of years on like some of the bulletin boards where they have like bubble disease of like a cropra, and that is got to be some sort of organism. Literally, the tissue like swells up, fluid develops underneath it, and I doubt seriously that it's something from lighting or otherwise, but I think in some of those cases, they've taken those corals and moved them to a new system and all that went away. So I don't know what to make of that either. It could also be some sort of organic molecule in the water, something we're feeding, something we're adding, just some sort of breakdown product that's causing these things to happen. But regardless, there's clearly an issue. And we have not got to the bottom of it yet.
I was really thinking that because like even where you said if you move it from one system to another, it changes because there's been people that have paid ridiculous amounts of money for these bounce mushrooms and then moved them into their system and they've gone back to being a completely normal mushroom coral. So that's
Right.
that's the only reason I was thinking maybe it has something to do with the lighting, but it could be completely off
I mean,
too.
it's hard to say. I mean, I had halides back in the day, and
Yeah.
you know, I don't remember the same degree of like disease or other things that we have nowadays. And I don't think it's related to the halides. I think it has more to do with, again, we have vendors that are selling things with disease.
Right.
So, I mean, that's more likely to be the case. We aquaculture and mariculture things all the time. And I think that those are big contributors to this sort of problem.
Could it be a genetic mutation? Is something happening where these corals are not getting diverse enough? I mean, what's happening within these corals when they start to grow that we don't
Abnormally.
understand?
Could be. I mean, there could be all sorts of things, but it's contagious. That's the
weird.
thing that makes me think it's, yeah. So essentially, I bought a Valley Blue Slimer frag, and because I was like, oh, okay, I really like to have a blue branching Acropora young guy, which is what the Valley Blue Slimers are. But it doesn't grow like a branching coral. It becomes a little blob of coral tissue that has enlarged polyps on it that don't grow into branches. So I had that, and now I have green slimer, red slimer, and like purple slimers, all that do the exact same thing. So clearly it spread. In addition, it spread to other corals beyond just the Acropora youngi. And so I've seen it in other corals where essentially the branches stop growing, the polyps enlarge, and the coral becomes abnormal looking. So to me, if it's infectious, it's more likely to be some sort of like organism rather than like conditions. But it's hard to say, and I'm not sure what organism that would be.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions for Dr. B before we wrap it up? I think there's definitely going to be follow-up episodes on this with regards to settling. Mike even mentioned there about coral diseases and pests. I think that would be a great one to do as well. I definitely have some stuff I'd like to talk about with regards to parasitic copepods. So yeah, anyone have any?
Oh yes, you and me both.
Oh yeah, how's that situation working out?
I've been on call so much recently. I haven't had any time to do anything. It's going to take 8 hours to dip the entire tank. So I'm like, I just have had zero time, but it will happen. It's just going to be in the future. Like this weekend, I'm going to put together the coral trays that I can use for dipping and stuff. But
I wonder.
yeah, I do not look forward to that nightmare.
Oh yeah, I wonder if that is going to affect your spawn. I mean, is that potentially going to set you back?
Maybe, but you have to, I mean, I have to think, the ocean's where these things come from. It's not like we grew them in captivity. So, I mean, if a Toothalopsis and all the other ones are in the ocean, they don't stop spawning there. So I would like assume that it would be okay, is assuming we don't have like a massive infection that kills a bunch of stuff. But
Well, I just hope
we'll
you
see.
get them to spawn and you can document it, because that would be absolutely incredible. And this has been an amazing presentation. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned something, and I definitely want to give it a try. So thank you so much, Mike.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Mike.
This has been great. As always, if anyone wants to join Discord chat after this for a catch up, feel free. Thanks again, Mike.
Awesome, Mike. Thank you.
Absolutely.